This is the second talk. We're trying to familiarize ourselves with the beings and principles involved in the Christ mystery. Yesterday we tried and labored very hard to be experiential about understanding who Christ was. After today, the next 3 or 4 talks, we're going to try and enrich that view of Christ and become very close with that, because that is our destiny. Today we're going to speak more about the human side and a little bit about the composite side, which is extremely difficult to talk about. One thing about our teaching is, compared to almost any other kind of teaching in the world, it's comforting. There's something about knowing the truth and knowing that the truth is filled with love that is very, very comforting. And one of the most comforting things, at least it was for me when I came into this way of seeing things, one of the most comforting things is the realization that we all have purposes. We have individual purposes and we have collective purposes. But we also have goals. And those goals are more specific than purposes. In general, purposes are found in the 9th house, and goals are found in the 10th house. Purposes are open-ended. You can never attain your ideal, or you can never reach a purpose, because purpose is something transcendental. You're always, it's like playing blind man's bluff, if you remember that game, and you were supposed to reach somebody, and they'd say, you're getting warmer, you're getting warmer. That's what discovering purpose is like. You can't capture it. It's like the universal ideas. Goals, on the other hand, are very specific. They're like milestones. They are sentinels. There are certain things that we have to attain to. And this is universally, going way back into history. Purpose in the Orient, for example, was called dharma. And the action that we took to attain something was called dharma. And those words still apply to this day. The actions that we need to do to attain to a certain goal are ruled by those same houses. But all of the goals and purposes are internal. We're internal to a universe. That everything that transpires with cause and consequence within it. And this universe has goals as well. And we are microcosms of the universe. And with the law inside of ourselves, every time we take an action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. There's a creative forward-goingness to it. But what we are is what we do and what we become. What we do is how we are going to be in the future. Now, myself, I'm sort of a rebel, and I'm sort of a creative person. And so one of the things that when I first started studying astrology, for example, I rebelled against it because I thought it was so old-fashioned. And so what I'm trying to do over the years is produce a modern astrology and an astrology that's experiential. But in another way, when I first came to the teaching, I was an atheist. I didn't believe in anything. And as a consequence, what came out of that is one of the works or one of the goals that has been given for me to do is, as I mentioned the other night, to try to present Christ and Christianity to the world without the Bible. Because there are a lot of people who don't know about the Bible. It's just not part of their culture. And those are the sorts of people that I run into. Now, the other night, we were able to come to some understanding, or last night it was, that we were able to come to an understanding of Christ without having to use the Bible. We used the principles of the Rosicrucian cosmoconception, and most of all, we used our own experience. But today, we're talking about Jesus. And it's kind of hard to be completely experiential and non-biblical and introduce people to the conception of Jesus as the leader for all of humanity for now until the end of our evolution. You just can't walk in and bring some stranger and say, "This is my friend Jesus." His name is sometimes called Jesus, sometimes it's called Jesher. Sometimes call him Josh for short. Or if you try to do something like that, people would hoot you off out of the room. You know, it just doesn't work that way. So I'm in a little bit of a fix because I got to try and introduce Jesus without using the Bible, because that's just an appeal to authority. When I get myself in a fix, if you do a lot of talking, and I do a lot of talking, you learn tricks. And one of my favorite heroes is a mercurial hero. I believe that all of the heroes in mythology are broken into the 7 rays. You know, some of them are very staunch warriors like Heracles, but the staunch warriors always go mad sometime in their life. Or, you know, another one is Lancelot, was a staunch warrior, and he went mad. And if you look, Gilgamesh was another, and all of the martial heroes have that happen. But being mercurial, I've always liked the mercurial trickster kinds of heroes, and so I've always liked wily Odysseus. And I've learned over the years that when you get in trouble, what you do is you quote somebody else. And if you quote somebody else and things don't work out, then you're off the hook at least. You know, this is just that's the ultimate lure for the mediums who now call themselves channelers. You don't have to be responsible if somebody else is doing the talking. And but when I came to putting the notes together for this talk, try as I might, I couldn't find anybody else to quote, because the incidence of trying to introduce an individual, a human being, and to do so experientially without the individual there aren't just that many quotes about that. And when I thought about it for a long time, the conclusion that I came to is that if you quote somebody else, that's just another appeal to authority. And so what you'll have to do is you'll have to try to be with integrity. And with integrity, you speak from your own experience. You don't talk about things that you don't know about, or if you do, you say that it's not from yourself. So what I'm going to do is try and look at the person of Jesus from experience, but use a little bit different mode of experience than most people work with. In our times, as opposed to biblical times, in our times the most direct and provable experience comes from science. Science has its own superstitions and it has its own beliefs. I work every day. I'm sort of a janitor. I'm an intellectual janitor to a number of scientists. I make their computers work and put the systems in that they want to work, and then I clean them up and tidy them up and things like that, and they can do their science. And I know that they're filled with superstitions, and they've got a belief system that is probably more superstitious than they would accuse us of having. But science does do some things. It proves, and it produces experiments that can be repeated. And therefore, if we're going to look at an experiential way at working into the Rosicrucian teaching and trying to come to some experience in ourselves that we can come to Jesus, let's look a little bit at some things in science. Now, there are a lot of things in science that show the principle of a leader. I'm not just talking about like a queen bee or something like that, or the lead ant, but one, for example, is this tree right out in front of the administration building. It's like all of the conifers, it has a primal cane, a center, a stem that goes straight up. And that in botany is called a leader. And any tree that has a strong leader, the branches go out at right angles. And they follow or they become subservient to the leader. That's a lovely principle. In fact, it gets abused. We abuse, like we're supposed to not look at the world for our own sake, but we abuse trees. Do you know what we do to trees so that they don't grow too tall? They do what is called open center pruning. They cut the leader off, and then there's sort of a hollow, and the tree doesn't grow tall, but there are a whole bunch of things, and it's easier to get up there with your pickers and pick the apples or whatever you're doing. We never think about the tree might have a purpose in existence. It might have, terrible things we do to cows. We have cows with huge big udders like that they put, they have cows wearing brassieres now, wide straps on their backs to keep the udders from going into the ground. We do a lot of that. But the favorite principle that I have that illustrates the leader principle comes from an area where chemistry and crystallography and atomic physics come together. I don't know if you remember your first chemistry course, if you ever had a chemistry course. One of the things that you proved was that there can be a supersaturated solution. And usually you use hypo. And the first thing you do is you put hypo in water and you let it dissolve until it has as much as dissolved as can possibly be dissolved. Then you heat that solution up, and then you add more hypo, because when it's heated up, more can go into solution. And then you let it cool down, but the hypo doesn't come out. The hypo is there in a supersaturated solution. It's clear. It looks just like water. Then what you do is you take one little tiny speck of hypo and put it in there, and zoom, everything crystallizes to the bottom. Another idea from the same part of chemistry and physics is crystal growing. I don't know if you've ever done crystal growing, but there is a way that you can grow crystals by an evaporation process. And you put a little seed crystal in the center. You usually dangle it with a thread, and then as water evaporates, the thing that comes out of solution grows around the seed crystal, and you build huge, big, perfect crystals like that. And they're just an awesomely beautiful thing to see. Years ago, Elsa Glover and I used to work on things like that. She helped me get set up with that kind of a setup for growing crystals. Now, these are excellent things that show that one little speck, being a seed crystal, or the seed crystal that you dangle in your solution and let it evaporate, those are principles in nature that demonstrate the idea of a leader and everything being precipitated by that leader and clinging to that leader. And nature, as we know, is the face of God. We also know, if we want to go to the Bible, that God is a spirit and must be worshipped in spirit and in truth. And we also know from the Bible that we are created in the image of God. Therefore, our essential nature is also spirit. And our persona is itself natural and is itself the face of God. Therefore, if we look into nature to find the truth of God, and if we look into ourselves, if we look into God to find the truth of nature, we have a universal principle. I didn't state that really clearly, but this is a universal principle that I use a lot. If we want to know the truth of the outer world, we look within. If we want to know the truth about ourselves, we look without. You know how it goes when you're supposed to write an essay on something, some subject, and you don't know what you think about that, and suddenly you start writing and you externalize what was in you all along. By their fruits ye shall know them, so that what is within comes out in the fruits. And by looking at the fruits, you can tell what goes on within. This is a very important, this is really the essence of our concentration, or our perceptive concentration and discrimination exercises in the Rosicrucian teaching. It's that we observe hoping to understand the meaning from within. Now, the early Rosicrucians did the same thing. The early Rosicrucians were alchemists. And that was sort of a cover, because it was necessary to keep from being persecuted. They were doing spiritual work, but they also actually did some chemical work. And what they did when they were doing chemical experiments is they looked at the processes as something that took place inside of them. What happened outward in nature was also something that was taking place inside. In fact, they got to the point after a while, you know what hermetic sealing is? Hermetic sealing is when you put all the components that you're going to use to change base metals into gold, you put them into something and you seal it with a spiral kind of seal, and everything you need is in there and you cook it. That relates to a stage of spiritual development when you realize everything you needed, you were born with. And you don't need anything outside of yourself. And you don't, when you start listening to the voice of the Christ within, you don't listen to outer authorities. And you seal yourself and you create the gold from within. It's not quite that kind of process that I'm looking at. But one of the things that the alchemists found was that when they were firing, when they were burning something up in fire, because there are a lot of elements that when you burn them in fire, they put off beautiful, beautiful colors. They're called borax bead tests. And you can tell what something is by the way it fires. The alchemists saw the principle of firing as a principle of applying the will, burning something up in firing. And that's true. On the other hand, when something was taken into solution, they saw that as when they, if you watch the process of solution where the material substance becomes less and less and less, and it's assimilated into the invisible water, that process they saw as the assimilation, much as we in the Rosicrucian, modern Rosicrucian teachings see that there is an assimilation of gross experience as soul matter into the spirit. And so they took, what's happening every day in the world, even when we're putting sugar in our coffee, is a process that if we see in ourselves, there's something similar like that taking place. Now, the process of crystallization, they saw as the process of condensing thoughts. That is like when the crystals come out of the solution of hypo, or you grow a crystal in solution. I should have brought one along. I have a lovely, perfectly crystal clear crystal that I grew at one time. It's just you're just in awe looking at the thing. There's so much perfection there. But that crystallization process is exactly parallel to the crystallization process that takes place when we concentrate our thought. Because a crystal, as a physicist will tell you, an atomic physicist will tell you, that a crystal is a close-packed structure. That as close as you can get the little atoms together, that in 3 dimensions, in 2 dimensions, the most that you can get, if all of the atoms were one size, the most that you can get around 1 is 6 around the 7th. In 3 dimensions, if you try to take everything with an infinitely small radius and all the same radius and put them around, it turns out that the most that you can pack around any one center is 12. It's 12 around the 13th. And it's the principle of the dodecahedron, if you're familiar with the Platonic solids. The 12 around the 13th is the whole basis for the way crystalline structure develops. However, all in the world as it is now, they aren't all of the same radius. Some of the atoms have a larger and some of them have a smaller radius, and that's why the crystals aren't all dodecahedrons. In fact, almost none of them are dodecahedrons. Some of them are parallelograms and all sorts of figures like that. But the result is the same. You have condensed and concentrated matter as clear, as close as it can be packed. And the same kind of result happens. When you concentrate matter, it's the same thing as you concentrate your thought. Everything becomes lucid. Everything becomes crystal clear. You can see right through. And that's the process that we're talking about. Now, the modern Rosicrucians, Max Heindel, says exactly the same thing. We all know that this process of concrete thinking is down here on the other side of the zodiac. It's ruled by Gemini. And we know that in the latter part of the Atlantean epoch, which our teaching teaches is associated with Gemini, that we learned the ability from having repeated experiences to connect them in concrete thoughts so that we recognize a relationship between cause and consequence. And the ability to think concretely was associated with Gemini in another way. It was associated with the ability to build lungs so that we could take in the air as a clear, fresh substance, so we could get our oxygen directly without having to go through the protection of water. And we, in fact, by the same process, we actually even cleared the air, because our concentration precipitated the Atlantean fog. Remember, we are creators. Now, we didn't cause the whole Atlantean flood that way, but we are part of the creative hierarchies. And our evolution goes hand in hand with the cosmic evolution. So as we evolve the ability to think concretely, to precipitate thoughts, we precipitated lungs and we precipitated the atmosphere. Okay, we're getting closer. Now, our concrete thinking didn't end in Atlantis. It has continued, and it has gotten better and broader. It sort of goes like a spiral of Archimedes, which is made out of the golden section. You know, we start doing a little bit, and then we get more, and we get more. It goes something like that. That our thought activity actually increases. As a consequence, we now live longer. As we noticed last night, the ability to think that the spirit, the threefold spirit, the ego, as it takes control of the mind and exercises it in thinking, it develops power. And that power is called the will to live. And because we can think more clearly, and because we can make and imbue our thoughts with a greater force of will, we live longer. That's one of the consequences that comes out of it. Our concentration gets deeper and deeper and better all the time. It's amazing if we could, if we had the full clairvoyance and could go back and read our consciousness as it was just 10 years ago and then look at what our concentration is now, we'd be very much surprised. Okay. Now, I'm working hard again, so I'm going to have to this concentration, as we noted last night, the thought forms we produce a vacuum, a singing, humming, hollow vacuum. In fact, we could have said last night, I'm in a good place today, so I might take a few little side trips, make it a little longer. In fact, this is the story. Do you like stories and myths? I love them. You know, there was the famous musical contest between Apollo and Pan as to who had the most beautiful, who made the most beautiful music. And you know who they chose to judge the musical contest? Midas. After he made the big blunder of turning his daughter into gold, they figured he learned his lesson, and they chose him to judge this musical contest. And they each got out and played their music. Pan played the flute, or the Pan's pipes, and Apollo played his lyre, the strings. And those are exactly what it's like. The phenomenal, the concrete mind is we make these empty hollows, these vacuums, and they're sort of like the pipes of Pan. Whereas the higher mind, where the self is located, and the self is always indicated by the sun, and that self, when it plays its lyre, it's not negative, it's positive. It radiates from itself. It gives the answers. And so the music of Apollo was certainly more beautiful than the music of Pan, but not to Midas's ears, because because Midas was a very worldly man, and he said Pan's music is more beautiful. So Apollo struck him with a curse and gave him ass's ears, and all the rest of his life he wore a turban. But he had only the hairdresser nose, and he had a hairdresser, and he made that hairdresser swear on his life that he would tell no one that he had ass's ears. So only the hairdresser ever saw him without the turban. But you know how it is. It's like what we have. We have something that we're full of, and we can't keep it a secret. It would be sinful to do so. And so the hairdresser was filled with this secret. And so what he did is he went down to the swamp and he dug a hole in the ground and he whispered in there, Midas has ass's ears. And he covered it up, and he figured he was free. And then the reeds grew up, and the reeds rustling in the wind whispered, Midas has ass's ears. And the secret was out. That's just a little side story. And so we're in this process of precipitating. It carries into our future, because we know that at some time in the future that we are going to precipitate a new heaven and a new earth, and it's going to be something like the precipitation of the hypo-autosolution, because the new earth is going to be completely crystalline, as when Hiram melted all of the elements of the earth together into a crystal when he was making the fountain outside the Temple of Solomon. Now, we're at the point of how we think and how we form these hollow thought forms. We mentioned last night that this is primarily questioning, that vacuum is a question, and that the higher self gives the meaning or gives the answer. But I want to look a little bit more into detail now. It's a general evolutionary principle. Heindel mentions it frequently, that creatures or we evolve according to conditions. The classic example that Max Heindel gives is the eye evolved according to light. The nature of light is the way our eye evolved. If the light had been different, our eye would have evolved differently. Now, this is a general evolutionary principle. Now, the same is true. It's true in our time. Do you know that? The atmosphere and the light is changing. It isn't an accident that the ultraviolet light is coming through more. That, those holes in the ozone partially due to pollution, but I believe this is cosmically intended. Because if you take the description of ultraviolet light and lay it down to next to Max Heindel's description of etheric vision, the two are identical. The animals and insects and such see in the ultraviolet spectrum, and ultraviolet can't penetrate through glass. So what science describes as ultraviolet, that higher end of the spectrum, is closer to etheric vision than we think. And like what's happening right now, there's a lot of skin cancer happening. When Max Heindel says that we're eventually going to have blue skin and such like that the people of the future are going to be blue, I believe that is due to the ultraviolet. Because we'll continue to get skin cancer until we develop strong enough etheric bodies, until our vital bodies become very strong and we emanate a protection from it. See, we evolve according to the conditions of the cosmos. And the richness of the ultraviolet light in the atmosphere is going to cause us to evolve the vision to see in the ultraviolet spectrum, which is etheric vision. These things are not accidents. I may be all wrong about this, but it certainly strikes me, from the little I know about science, it certainly strikes me as being true. Now back to our mainstream of thought. The mind also evolves. And the mind, just like the eye, had to have something to evolve according to. This means that there had to have been thought or thoughts for us to evolve a mind to think on. Now, where do these thoughts come from? Well, in our tradition, in our Rosicrucian teaching, the seers say that we're not alone in this. Unlike material science, which thinks that we're the height of evolution, we're somewhere in the middle of it. And that the cosmos has within it many, many hierarchies. Gods of greater and lesser stature, demigods, demons, fairies, all sorts of things. And these are the creative helpers, the creative beings within God, the macrocosm. And these beings think thoughts. And their thinking is a much stronger degree of thinking and a much truer degree of thinking. And like Brunhilde in the Wagner's operas, they read the heart of God. And they produce thoughts which could be called cosmic archetypes. And these cosmic archetypes are what we imitate in our thinking. And therefore we can say that we creatures evolve according to conditions that are produced by creators. And in our minds, when we change the world, when we change our bodies, when we go along with the process of evolution, it's not a blind process. It's not that we're just wandering in the wilderness and just by chance finding our way. What we are doing is we are attuning ourselves and thinking on, we make very poor replications, but we're thinking on the divine archetypes made by the Elohim, or made by the creative hierarchies. Now, principle, oh boy, I gotta be careful here that I don't get myself too far away. If I get lost from my notes in something like this, I'll get myself in big trouble. Now, in the center, in the spiritual center of all of these archetypes is one central archetype. And that central archetype, we're not going to talk much about it. We'll mention it a little bit now, and in the second last talk we'll mention it a little more. It deals with the Rosicrucian cosmoconception, tells us the deepest of all mysteries, the one that we'll learn at the 13th or last initiation, the last of the greater initiations, and that is the mystery of the creative mind. That is to say, there is a central archetype that focuses or is associated with the creative center of God. That is the central mind, you might say, of the whole cosmos. It bears a similar relationship to the silent watcher in a human being, which is associated and is almost synonymous in location with the seed atom of the mind in a human being. So at this very center of our being, and in the very center of the cosmos, it's not a center that we can draw on the board, but it's a center that we can focus on with our mind, is the archetype of creative thinking, where we take things from the absolute and bring them out into the cosmos. Surrounding that central archetype is the gigantic archetype that is sometimes called the primordial atom. The primordial atom is described in all of part 2 and most of part 3 of the cosmoconception. All of the globes and rounds, all of the revolutions of consciousness, the epochs, the periods of time, they are all part of the idea of the whole creation, the thought of the whole creation, and that is called the primordial atom. That's around this central core of existence. See, this is a matter of the deepest of all mysteries when we're talking about the mystery of the mind. And there's something I want to really bring home at this point, because there's often in spiritual students there's an impatience about seeing the spiritual worlds, and a lot of people go for razzmatazz kinds of exercises that are going to bring them all kinds of phenomena. That is utterly stupid, because in the cosmoconception, the simple exercises that we are given there are about, it all depends on our effort, but they're about as deep as you can go. What we're saying is that if in our concentration we reach the heart of that creative archetype from which everything has come into existence in all of the phenomenal worlds, and even by reflection into the transcendental worlds, we can do that right in our simple concentration exercises. Our exercises are not just beginning exercises. They are as advanced as we want to take them. They're not, it's just not simple at all. All right. Now, this central archetype that is at the heart of the cosmos is the source in ourselves of our personality, of all of our outward character. It's very much like the Bible says, as one thinketh in their heart, so are they. That is to say that what our personality is, and what our personality is what our individuality becomes, because the individuality feeds on the experience of the personality, that is determined by the character of the thinking or of the thinker. And thinking is our service. The next point I'm trying to make is that thinking is what we do for the cosmos. Let's review a little bit of our elementary cosmology. We know that from the mineral kingdom, the service, everything in the universe gives service. Absolutely everything. The mineral kingdom gives form. We wouldn't have this form if it weren't for the mineral kingdom. Neither would any plant or animal. Life, on the other hand, vitality, is given by the plant kingdom. Do you know that no human being or no animal can live without the stuff? They've tried it. They took the pride of the German Navy once, and they took them out and they put them in a submarine without any fresh, raw food. And they came back in 6 months' time, and quite a few of them died. And it took a long time to rejuvenate them, because no animal, no human can live without the vitality that is taken from the sun and specialized by the plants. So what the plants give as a service is life, vitality. What animals give as a service is motivation, desire, feeling. It's just like that old story that Prometheus gave each of the animals a different character, and that in each, it's what we're looking at when we're looking at zoology. We say to some people, "You're a creepy lizard," or we say, "Oh, you're a beautiful bird," or something like that, because we have those the different feelings, the different character types are found in the motives of animals, in the feelings of animals. But human beings, our service is thinking. It's not to say that we don't have a vital body or a physical form, but our service is thinking. What we give to the cosmos and what is our duty is to think. And the more truly that we think and the more abundantly that we think, the more that we're serving the cosmos. It's going to be a thing that we're going to come back to in one of the later things. Okay, we've already discussed some of this already. That thing's a little bit out of order. Now, even though our primary work is thinking, and even though things come into the cosmos through that central archetype of creative thought, that does not mean that we live in some gigantic mental hologram. That's not the case at all. Because thinking is the beginning of the process, and it's the beginning of the process where the spiritual, the transcendental spiritual world and the ideas and the creative love from there are brought into a finality. The material world is a world of final. The phenomenal realms, things are precipitated here, and even in their illusory nature, in their resistance, they give us something of completion. There is a realization that takes place. That what begins with thoughts and becomes crystallized as far as material forms, there is a realization and a finalization of what before was a dream in the spirit. And just because our primary work is thinking, that does not mean that we shouldn't come into the external worlds, into the worlds of desire or vitality or something like that, and have a complete experience as a human being. Now, believe it or not, we're right on the verge of discovering Jesus. Strangely enough, and we're on the verge of discovering Jesus without reverting to the Bible. But because we have to have a purpose in all of this, because we have to keep toward the goal, because there's a great tendency to indulge in spiritual things and to surfeit ourselves in spiritual things, and that's something we may not do. It's a form of vanity, and vanity is a kind of a treacherous thing. You have to remember vanity. We're going to come back to that in just a little bit. So we have to ask ourselves, again, even though this has been experiential, we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean, and how can I use it, or else it becomes a vain thing. So let's review. We're saying that there is a central archetype of creation and creative thinking, and that we, as humans, have as our essential service to be thinkers. And that surrounding the central archetype is the archetype called the primordial atom. And a really important thing is that in this process of realization, through thinking and bringing things into existence, the whole process is a great experiment. The alchemists saw it as, let me try this. It was a leap of faith. And it's a creation. If we say, I'm going to create a painting, or if we say, I am going to create a song or a poem or something like that, that's precisely what God in the macrocosm is doing. And I don't think it is profaning to say that, because to some extent, there's Robert Frost's law about poetry. If there are no surprises for the poet, there are no surprises for the reader. And if it isn't a genuine creation, if it isn't a genuine experiment for God relative to the unknown of the absolute, it isn't rote to God. What we live in is wonderfully alive. It's filled with thoughts and feeling and wonder and all of that. And this is not just some kind of experiment. All right. What we have said is thinking is a creative process. In effect, we've said if it's a realization process, if I can think it, it is. I had a friend that could do amazing things on a guitar. He says, if I can picture it in my mind, I can make my hand do that. And he could play a fantastic pieces of music. 4-part polyphony he could play on a guitar. And it was fantastic to listen to. But so we're talking about the realization process of thinking and the creative part of thinking. Thus, you see where I'm trying to get to. If we ask, like Shakespeare does, what's in a man? Or when we ask ourselves day by day, what's it all about? Or, as we've asked time and again in these talks, what does this mean? Every time we do that, every time we question and draw ourselves to a deeper and deeper questioning concentration, we draw ourselves clearer, more closer to the center, that primordial, that central archetype of all creative thinking. When we think, what does this all mean? Or what are my thoughts about? We draw ourselves closer to the center of creative thought in us and in the cosmos. That's a really important thing, because it sort of says, like the Bible says, if we seek something, we'll truly find it. We'll truly be drawn to that. But our thinking is, it's a skill. It's like drawing. At first when we start drawing, we can't draw very well. But when we keep practicing, our drawing becomes more representative. And after a while, we can be perfectly representative, and then we can be creative. It's a skill. Now, this means the more we think, the more we draw ourselves closer to the cosmic archetypes, and the more perfect our life becomes. So this is a really important thing of as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. It's the more we do, we come closer to that. Now, it must... be careful here. This central archetype that is sort of the seed atom of the heart. I'm really lost in my notes here. This is a shame. This centralmost archetype, which is in the heart of the cosmic archetypes, sort of, you might say, the seed atom of the entire cosmos, as people draw themselves to it, they become like it, and they become associated with it. In fact, there comes a time that in the center of the whole archetypal process, that a human being draws to and becomes the representative of that central living thought. And that human being is then identified with the center of the human state. And in that condition, that human being merges with it and in fact becomes the living center of it. And all other beings are then drawn to that. And this being then is the leader for all of humanity, all thinking. This is the being that we in Christianity refer to as the biblical truth. This is Jesus. Now, what we're saying here, one doesn't even have to speak about the Bible. One can point right straight to the truth. You can say there is a center of all things, and there is a being who has, by his thinking, by his association with the creative center of all things, has become representative of the human condition. And that is our leader. This is not a leader. This is not saying, well, I'm giving this person a title. And it's not, you see, you understand what I'm trying to say? This is non-sectarian. It points to an individual. It points to someone that we can relate to as a human being, especially the more we think, the closer we can come to that. So that it's not saying, this is, in many ways, what happens when we bring up biblical Christianity. People have opinions about the Bible, and they have an opinion about Jesus, and that gets in the way of realizing that kind of truth. That you can't see something for what it is because of your beliefs about it. It's just like we said last night, like you've changed, but your parents have a view of you as having been as they've always known you, and they've got that so cemented in their consciousness that it becomes like a veil over their eyes, and they're always seeing you with that. The same thing is true with Jesus, because there are attitudes about Jesus, and those attitudes have become pervasive in people's consciousness so that they cannot see the reality of it. Okay, we're going to, we can talk about this being And we can dedicate ourselves to this being every time we concentrate, and we don't have to say that this is Jesus. Probably Jesus isn't the name anyway, because everybody knows that all the names in the inner worlds are different kinds of names, and they're not at all like what we have here. Now, now that we've gotten to the subject of Jesus a little bit, I want to do some little asides about this, because there are a lot of sophistries about the nature of Jesus. And some of them are confusing. Like, I don't know if you've run into them, but there are people that have taken the idea of the average as Einstein uses the average. Einstein uses the conception as if to say that if there is a barrel of stones, there is an average stone. Though none of those stones in that barrel may be the average stone, all of them have something in common with that, in that they partake of that averageness which is the stone. And there are people that will say, well, Jesus represents the average, the ultimate average man, and that all human beings or anyone in the human state relates to that averageness of Jesus. That is not true. There's a big difference between centrality, and it is because of the remarkability of Jesus and because of the centrality of Jesus, and not because of some middling kind of average that this being holds the place that it does in the cosmos. I don't know, I just put that in because I don't know whether people... I run into a lot of very curious people with a lot of very curious notions. Now, there's one thing I want to clarify and extend from what we talked about last night. Now, what I don't want to produce a misconception here, because it is conceivable that from this point of view, one could then say Jesus is the ultimate mentalist. And that is what got Jesus the centralmost position in the cosmos as our leader. This is a likelihood that can occur when we do things in this sort of shallow talk about one thing and then not be able to really develop it. I want to go back to the vacuum again. The vacuum is not just mental questioning, because this is living spiritual character. Jesus was probably the most sane of all human beings, and probably the least vain, because the quality, men, if you're out driving with your sweetie and you get lost, men hate to ask for directions. If we're in a man's body, we have that. It seems there's something about the masculine condition that has an endemic pride, and that you get where I'm trying to get to. That to ask a question is to be humble. The ultimate of humility is like in the prayer of the sinner, of the publican and the sinner. Lord, I am a sinner, have mercy on me. And humility and sanity are one and the same thing. I've worked for years now with neurotics and psychotics and people like that figure that because this guy's got a crazy bookstore, they come for help. And do you know what I notice? Freud was brilliant, but you don't have to be brilliant to walk into an insane asylum and see that people who are crazy have sex problems, big sex problems. But it isn't the sexual energy that is the problem. The energy is neutral. Just like a light, you can take up a flashlight and you can use it to light the way, or you can use it as a second-story person to break into somebody's house. The light is the same light. The sexual energy is the same sexual energy, whether we're profaning it or whether we're using it in high magic and healing or something like that. But what is the big problem is the vain use of it. If you look at anybody that's in a mental institution, they all have some extreme kind of vanity. They'll say, "You got to let me out of here. I'm the only one that can mop the floors at the cafeteria right." There is, because when we get locked in that lower self, we close ourselves off from the healing that comes from God. And if we don't have a flow going through us, we're going to become more and more separated from reality, and we're going to become sicker and sicker and sicker. And show me somebody who's humble, and I'll show you somebody who is a sane individual. Somebody who has... You can't make yourself humble. You know that. It's all of the best things in character we can't make ourselves do. However, if we stand in awe, if we reverence that from which all of the healing light comes, then we're automatically humble. We're humbled relative to the reality, to the greatness and to the beauty of God, and not because we've made ourselves humble. But in the act of questioning, we become our human best. We become humble. And therefore, the quality that attracted Christ, that attracted Jesus to become that center, to be closest to the creative center of the cosmos, was a questioning quality, but a questioning quality of humility and not just a pure mentalism. And another interesting thing about all of this is that there is some synchronous kind of harmony about this. In that, as Paul says, we are a curious first fruits, or I think he calls it a peculiar first fruits, meaning to say that there's something very rare and very special about this. The human condition is that, because we were at the beginning of the cosmos when it was at its beginning, and we came to our ripeness in externality at the same time the cosmos came to its ripeness in externality. And at the same time that we draw in that period after Atlantis and before Galilea, when we pass from concrete thinking to ideational thinking into the Christ-like consciousness, that when we proceed from concrete thought to ideational thought to infinite thought, that in that period it's the center of the whole creation, it's the center of the cosmos, and the human being is the center in time as well as in space. And so we have this curious statement that is perfectly true in the Bible that says that the angels shall descend and ascend on the Son of Man. Meaning, because the Son of Man means that central, most representative, that human being that's at the center of the cosmos in time, so that the whole involution and evolution is around that very common center. It's just a sidelong thought. So it's awfully warm in here, isn't it? Is it warm? It's math on me just because I'm... Okay. Now I want to carry this a little bit further. We have come to understand that, now this is a really hard topic for me. We've come to understand that there is a centralmost being in the human condition. The very fact that there is that, the very fact that there is a hierarchy, the very fact that there is a seed atom of the heart means that there's a heart. And the fact that we can achieve means that there is the possibility of superlative achievement. And what I'm trying to get to is that the being Jesus is very central and very unique, but not totally unique. Again, if we return to science, we'll find that in everything from the division of an atom to the way a solar system develops, we find a principle where there is always a center, like the yolk of an egg, and a field, like the white of an egg. And each performs a different function. That at the center is where the creative work is done, where the controlling work is done, but out in the field is where the metabolic work is done, where the ongoing work is done. This is where all the genetic stuff is in the center, and out in the field is where the food is taken in and metabolized and such like that. This same is true of humanity and every other life wave. There is, or there develops in every life wave, a nucleus, a center that has taken the idea of achievement and carried it to the ultimate that is possible within that life wave, within that principle. And in our Rosicrucian teaching, that which is the center, that state of being is called highest initiate, without the proper article. Now this gets on to things that are really difficult. It's hard for me because I don't like elitism. I don't think that the initiate or the highest initiate state is elitist. There may have been more effort, and there may have been more work and more love and such like that to attain to that state, but I don't think there is elitism involved in it. Because this is one of the charges that is always leveled against us as mystery students when we talk about initiates versus ordinary humanity. They say, oh, you're elitists. I don't think it is. There's nothing about the initiate state that spurns anything, that looks down on anything. I think it is a matter of choice. It is a matter of sacrifice. If anything, it is a matter of more humility, that one is willing to subject oneself to greater pains, to greater limitation for the sake of serving others. I do not believe that the initiate or the highest initiate group is more beloved of God. It's just a choice to do things a different way. But we've got, all right, I don't want to get into too many sidetracks. This is awfully choppy today. So we have, in humanity, we have highest initiate state. And the highest initiate state is such that they have taken the human condition to the ultimate. It works in such a way that the highest initiates have done the human work of concrete thinking. They've taken that to such a degree that they don't even need to use a physical body and a theory body or a desire body. They're capable of functioning. They've gotten as much as you can possibly get out of those vehicles. And they're capable of functioning full-time in the world of thought. By sacrificing that downstream activity, they are capable of reaching deeper upstream and going deeper into the realm of the divine. There are some lovely charts and a lovely study of it in the Cosmoconception talking about that. But what we're talking about here is that the nucleus, the yolk of the egg, are the creative thinkers in charge of the creative elements inside the earth. Because what happens in the spiritual worlds outside of the earth, if we read the Cosmoconception carefully, is where the mainstream of humanity carries on. But in the nucleus of the earth, the word creative is used in that section on the constitution of the earth many times over, is where the creative activity is accomplished, the creative activity that moves our evolution forward. Okay. We might expect that in the same way that the deeper we think, the more we perfect our physical vehicles. We noted yesterday that the more we concentrate, the more differentiated the self becomes by the will of actually doing the thinking. And so it turns out that people like the highest initiates become indeed the most differentiated, the most individuated, the most unique of all of humanity. Jesus then represents the highest initiate of the highest initiate state of humanity. The unique being that represents humanity. Now, we said yesterday that the process of a self being conceived by the divine spirit and the life spirit is a process that divine spirit, life spirit, self. We said that that process was called Immaculate Conception. We can now take that process of Immaculate Conception and go a step deeper with it. Because what we as human beings do is no different than when other beings were human-like. That is to say that there was always and will always be a yolk and a white, a nucleus and a field. And so in previous periods of evolution, according to the evolutionary work of their time, we have people who are also representatives. And these are representatives more in the sense of proxies. They're not delegates, they're actually empowered. So that the divine spirit and the highest initiate of the Saturn period is, we call, in the Christian mysticism, we call the Father. That this is a being that represents the ability to will with excellence in the same way that Jesus represents the ability to think with the ultimate of excellence. Associated with the Sun period and the life spirit is a being called the Son, who we talked of last night, that is Christ. And that being has the epitome of loving, of imagining, of working with life in the sense that we say that's life. That being then represents the light that is the life spirit, that is a manifestation of the invisible dark power that is the divine spirit or the Father. And finally, in the moon period, the highest of the angels, the being that can work with ideas to the ultimate end of ideas in the same way that Jesus works with the ultimate end of thought in our period, is called the Holy Ghost, or Jehovah. In Jesus becoming connected, there is a process of linking. Mind you, now this goes right back. I've lost my track in my notes here, and I'm trying desperately to get things back together again. I'm very sorry for this. But in the process of focusing and concentrating on a center, that center of all thinking around which the primordial atom is found, all of these beings, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, because we're talking about the center of the whole cosmos, all of them focus on that same common center. And there is a realization for these transcendental beings, being all the beings that these beings represent, all of the creative hierarchies. There is a realization through the center of concrete thought. And that center is Jesus. And you might say then, this is the, are you familiar with the tetragrammaton of the Old Testament, the 4 vowels of the sacred word? The fourth member, where all 3 are linked in and are realized through, is in the tetrahedral figure of Jesus. It is the whole notion of the realization or the finalization. When our thoughts or when our attitudes are bad, it isn't until they come into our physical bodies and we become ill that we can say, yes, it's indubitable now that I've suffered, that I've sinned. Because you can't doubt the pain, you can't doubt the deformity. It has been finalized. And that whole finalization process, that whole externalization process that brings about the realization, is accomplished through the concrete mind and is accomplished in the earth period, which is the center of the whole creative work that we're doing, and therefore centered on the being of Jesus is a realization or a finalization of the cosmos, of even the representatives of the Holy Trinity, that there is a finalization. And this is, so what I'm trying to say is that Jesus, or the being of Jesus, represents a rallying point for us, for humanity, and represents a grounding point or a rallying point for the transcendence. And this is an extremely important activity. This is what all the fulfillment, you might say, or the realization. I hate to use that word over again and again, because it's when we realize things or when we externalize things that we come to know what they really are, and that's what is taking place in the cosmos. All right. We now have a little bit of an idea of what is focused on that most humble of all human beings, Jesus. Now, in the same way that Jesus represents the epitome of thought and is a leader in everything from the phenomenal worlds, Jesus is also a leader in the transcendental realms. Because, as we said, when we begin to think and gain control of our minds, the spirit wakes up. The self wakes up. And therefore, the most perfect of the human state, would be the most awake in the spirit. Now, we noted last night, though we didn't use these terms, that the self is an idea, and that there is a universal of universal ideas, and that is the selfness. That is what makes for altruism, where we love our neighbor as ourselves. And in the state of selfness is where we realize ourself. The first human to realize self in selfness is Jesus. And therefore, when we come to realize ourself within the selfness, not just know ourself, but know ourselves as a focus of that general selfness, that is what the term Jesus Christ means. It means that a self has awakened to itself within something greater. Okay, we're going to talk about that more later on. That'll be in another talk that we talk about that. So very quickly we have distinguished Jesus and Jesus Christ. Now, it's a very brief, very, very choppy outlook of Jesus. I'm very sorry for this presentation, but I can't always stay in complete concentration. Now we have only to treat the person or the being of Christ Jesus. And now I have to do something that I like to do even less. I have to talk not from my own experience, which is something I hate to do, because I think the only time we manifest integrity is when we speak from our own experience and something that we have brought to life in our own selves. Any time that we talk about a doctrine, no matter how true it may appear to be to us, and don't speak from our own conviction of ourself, we're not acting in the highest integrity, and we're not sharing the very best that we can share. So what I say from here on in the talk, I want to be treated like a story. And let it be treated like a story that we're all familiar with, and a story that is meaningful to us and that we've had some thoughts about, but not necessarily that we have experienced it. We have in ourselves experienced the central concentration, but in our waking consciousness, at least as far as I'm concerned, I haven't experienced the fall of humanity. It gets replicated in my life, but I'm not wide awake to it. So we're going to talk a little bit about the fall of humanity. The fall of humanity in the Kabbalistic, in the biblical Western tradition, talks about the manner in which we came into the material world. It isn't the only fall we've taken, because in the discussion of the primordial atom, it is very much like the experience of our prayers. We go in deep, and then we come out. Then we go in deeper, and we come out. And we go in deeper yet, and then we come out. Every time we come a little closer, every time we congeal the truth a little bit more clearly, and then we withdraw. The primordial atom is described in that same way. You might say, according to the Rosicrucian teaching, we're in the middle of the middle of the middle of the middle of the primordial atom. In terms of periods, in terms of globes, in terms of revolutions of consciousness, and in terms of epochs, we're in the middle, the very middle of the middle of the middle. That means that successively coming to this condition, we've been going deeper and deeper and deeper into matter. We'll become farther and farther removed from the living creative spirit. And each time we have gone successively deeper, this is a fall. We fall into matter more and more deeply. It's something that we experience in some ways. But in just before this middle, in a period of time called Lemuria, we started coming to this physical material earth. And we started congealing dense physical bodies at the same time that the physical earth was congealing. That our bodies go as the body of the earth. When the earth dissolves into an energy ball, we'll be living in energy bodies. The timing on this is probably more in hundreds of thousands of years than in tens of thousands or in tens of millions. Probably hundreds of thousands is probably the better way of looking at timing. Several things were happening concurrently in this period. We were just coming into a physical body, a dense, solid physical body, at the same time the earth was. The mind was just beginning to develop. Previous to that, we were more like animals. We had vitality, we had form, and we had desires, but we didn't have a thinking mind. Nor did we have an indwelling spirit. We weren't awake to ourselves. We were asleep. And we had something like a second self, a lower self that was there to protect us, sort of like a complex instinct. Now, we as becoming individualities were not really in charge of our consciousness. And in coming into the material world at this time, previously we were guided completely by the gods, by the hierarchies. In the future, we will be a law unto ourselves. But in between, there was a slip. And this lower nature was vulnerable. And we were vulnerable to a class of beings, according to the story. And this class of beings had themselves made some mistakes. They made the big mistake of evolution. They became specialists. And evolution always likes generalists. Be able to be many things to many people, to be adaptable is what evolution likes. But these beings who were supposedly part of the angelic life waves became specialists in fire. And because of their specialization, they couldn't adapt to generalistic conditions. And therefore they tried to make us into specialists in such a way that they could reap from us. And they did that in a very cunning type of way. They tried to get us to rebel against any guidance. And behind the wisdom of that guidance. So they appealed, like if you tell a little child, for example, if you don't eat your vegetables, you're not going to grow up. That child identifies with growing up. Likes to see every year that it's an inch taller, inch or so taller. And if you're just becoming individual and somebody says, hey, you're not going to get your individuality unless you rebel, that's doing the same thing like you would do to a child. So they played on our weakness. And they wanted us to not be completely conscious of what they were doing. And they wanted us to experience things in a very unnatural way, in a way that that there would be waste of energy. Because in that waste of energy, they could draw off of us. And if we experienced things in a way that we couldn't feed the gods, in the way that we couldn't feed the cosmos, if we didn't perceive things in a way harmonious to the cosmos, then that would be indigestible to the gods. And they could, you know what I'm trying to say, they could draw it off of us. That's what they were trying to do. And so what they did is they appealed to us saying, we'll give you your individual freedom and we'll help you become immortal. Because at this time we were losing more and more of the spiritual light in coming into this world, but hadn't yet opened our eyes completely to the light of this world, and we were afraid of the dark. And they came with a false light, a light of desire, and said, we'll give you light and we'll teach you how to become immortal. And what they did is they brought us to such a state that we used the most divine energy that we have. We used the nuclear energy, because at this time, and up until this time, we were nuclear beings. We were like single cells. It wasn't until in this period that we and in that we were folded together, such that the creative potency that is focused in the genitalia and is now partially focused in the creative mind and in the word of power of the voice, that now plays between two centers on the spine. We're like almost like a cell that's dividing itself, and the yolk is split. On the other hand, the energy that used to flow within us, that allowed us the energy of the white of the egg, used to flow the palms of the hands and the palms of the feet. When you lay on hands or when you draw energy off of a person, you're manifesting that same kind of energy. But they taught us how to use the nuclear energy of sexuality, but out of harmony with wisdom. They brought us to an imbalanced state where we took experience over insight. And they taught us how to revel in that experience to our own personal selfish end, and not to such an end that it was an efficient understanding of the world. It's very hard to see the beauty of things when you're all carried away in passion. And it happens, you get drawn away and you're lost. So, our ultimate sin was that we selfishly used sacred creativity. We selfishly determined our own destiny without wisdom. And so we ended...
Sorry, I would have kept these at... I was trying to have keep these in the 90s.
As a consequence, we have developed a hold from this selfishness and this selfish misfocus and abuse of creative energy away from the light of insight. We have developed, instead of having a resolution where one form of glory leads to another form of glory, like the resolution of chords in a beautiful piece of music, we have instead had a resolution of one sin into another sin, The sin of selfishness and sexuality led to the sin of Cain and murder. And it's something like Macbeth, and before you know it, you're murdering on down the line and mending bodies and all things like that. We don't need to know how bad we are, because if we have any degree of conscience at all, we see it every day, and I'm not going to stand up here and try to preach or do something like that. But it's something that's very apparent to us. It continued on down the line until, since we are creative beings, and in the same way that we created the Ariana when the Atlantean rain fell, we have created a condition in the world where it is almost dead.
because that is the consequence of indulgence. Even if you indulge yourself in doing good, you harden. Things become harder and harder and harder. Show me a person that, I'm talking about a moral hardness and even physical hardness that comes about as indulgence. Now, there are three agencies that the cosmos has for softening of hardness. The first one is pain. When you're suffering of pain, you get softened up. However, in the same way that we can use pain to drive our prayers so that we can pray all the more deeply in our pain, we can use that to exert ourselves and set ourselves against God. And to a large extent, that happened. We became inured to our condition, and we hardened things even deeper under the tutelage of pain. A second thing was the second agency that the cosmos has for undoing hardness is a retrospective activity where things are unwound, a catharsis, where things are softened up by letting go of the energy and allowing it to unwind and go back into the spirit. Even this was not sufficient. Something special had to be done. There had to be something to soften the earth and to bring it back to life. So there had to be something that was as lively as we had become dead. Because you know how that is. The more you indulge yourself, the more dead you become, and the more you want to indulge yourself. It is the ascetic who has the really delicate taste, not the gourmand. The gourmand can only go for the foods that cloy the taste, and after a while they have to become more and more extravagant foods, whereas the ascetic can tell the difference between one grain of barley and another. You know, because if you eat so sparsely, you get so that you really get that delicate kind of taste. So there had to be that kind of life that came in, and it had to come from beyond our mental machinations. You have now brought the mind together into a coalescence with the desire body, and it becomes very scheming. In fact, it imitates everything that the higher self comes with. If the inner voice speaks twice the same way, it says the same thing twice, you never know that the second one isn't a counterfeit. This is why things that come from the Christ Spirit are always new, because it's the nature of the Christ Spirit to be new, because they have to be new, because once it's old, the lower self knows how to counterfeit that so carefully. You know, that's all black magic. All the symbols of black magic are just about the same as those of white magic. They just tweak it just a little bit, and the symbol changes just a little bit. The formula is very. So it had to come from beyond the mind. And it had to come to us in a state of freedom. We were locked in bondage. We freely asserted ourselves. We asserted the highest kind of freedom, the freedom to work outside of the plan. But in so doing, we didn't have the wherewithal to carry it off, and we ended up in very great bondage because we lived within a closed system. So that even our evil turns into good eventually if we stick with it. And it had to come from a being that we accepted into us. We had to accept this love into us. We had to accept this leavening force, this softening force into us. Otherwise we would have hardened so far that nothing possibly could have been done. And so there was, or is, a being that will volunteer to do this. Now, I'm sure all of you are tired right now, but I'd like you to conceive one thought that is a really magnificent thought. If you think of all of the wretched thoughts, all of the wretched deeds, all of the thoughtless things you've ever done, and then magnify it to all of humanity over all of the thousands of years. If you think of that big of a cesspool of malevolence, and then think of a being who has love equal to that and greater, that is the kind of infusion that was brought into the earth. That is what was brought into the earth by the being of Christ. We had to, now there are laws involved in this. It goes something like, if a composer wrote a old concerto for orchestra and flute, and the composer didn't know how to play the flute, he wouldn't possibly in any way expect the composer to be the soloist. He would have to be an experienced flute player. If he weren't, he couldn't even carry out his own work. In a similar way, the being of Christ, as loving as that being was, could not come into the human body of its own making because it didn't know how to play the flute. It didn't know how to make a physical body. Therefore, a special condition had to be made. A vehicle of consciousness whereby the divine could experience our state, including the fear of death. This is the irony. Destiny is always irony. We sought for immortality in the fall, and we ended up with the fear of death. It's amazing. And so this divine being, the Christ, had to experience as a human does, and we had to be open to receive that being into us. And it is a funny way of accepting people as citizens. We have to kill them, because that's to admit them into our club of sin. We have to draw blood. So this being of Christ had to enter into the earth. And the vehicle chosen for that was the vehicle of Jesus. Now, we're way too long already, and I'm going through this very, very fast, but we're at the hardest part of this talk. In fact, it's so hard that I really don't know what it is, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw out a few thoughts and let you think on them, because it has to do with the mystery of Christ and of the Incarnation. We are told that after Jesus and the Essenes working on the body of Jesus brought that physical and etheric body to a state of maturity and a state of perfection, so that that consciousness could enter in. At the baptism by John, the Christ enters the body of Jesus. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon. I can tell you what it isn't. It is not an overshadowing, as in the case of Krishna. In the case of Krishna, there was an overshadowing by the light spirit. And that case was what in the Orient called an incarnation of Vishnu. What Christ is to us, Vishnu is to them. It was not that, because that wouldn't count. It couldn't be that indirect as an overshadowing. It's very important that we understand this, because otherwise we're running around with a very big misconception. It was also not mediumship. Christianity could not be founded on mediumship. So the taking over of the body of Jesus was not like as it is done in mediumship, where the physical body and the etheric body are taken over. Usually the facial features change and the voice changes. Because if we read the Cosmoconception not carefully, we would conclude that it was a mediumistic kind of act. It had to be something like a death. That in effect, at the moment of death of Jesus, the vehicles became the vehicles of Christ. Now this is not so hard to believe, because if there are two births with Christ, there are also two deaths in the Christ Jesus consciousness. This is a really important thing. But it must also be understood here that this was not a suicide, because all of Christianity could not be based on either mediumship or suicide or indirect activity like mediumship. This is indeed an extreme unction kind of experience, that in the course of things, Jesus was to have died at this moment, and at that moment, before the silver cord was loosed, the vehicle was taken over by the Christ. This is an important thing to look into. I don't understand all of it, but I know that we are not a mediumistic organization, nor are we a suicide organization, or anything like that. All right. What we have done is we have reached the point where we understand then that the being during the 3 years of ministry after the baptism by John is the being that is called Christ Jesus. We now have differentiated between Jesus, the most humble of all human beings, and because of that, the state of attainment where he realized self within selfness, where he realized the character of his being within the light of all being in Christ, that is Jesus Christ. And it should be for every one of us that way. It should be Barbara Christ, it should be Ted Christ, it should be Daisy Christ. All of us should attain to that. And now we have the final being, which is a composite being with the etheric and physical bodies of Jesus, given up in a death-like state to the higher being Christ for the great work of transforming the earth. All the rest of the talks, except for the last 2, are going to be on the work of Christ. And the next 2 or 3, we're going to try to come closer to the experience of Christ and try to fill out the rather thin exposition we gave of it last night and carry it a step further. And in the last 2 talks, we'll talk about bringing it into our lives in a daily way. I'm sorry